Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in today. My name is Kate Tarrant and I work for the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group based in the southwest of Western Australia. For those of you that don't know us, we are a not-for-profit independent landcare organisation with an interest in sustainable agriculture and the broader environment and river health in the Lower Blackwood catchment. You can find more about us and the work that we do on our website at lowerblackwood.com.au. Today's webinar is supported by SoilWise. SoilWise is funded by the National Landcare Smart Farms Small Grants, an Australian government initiative, and it's supported by Healthy Estuaries WA, a state government program. Before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge that our Lower Blackwood catchment and the work that we do falls within Wadandi and Pilbaramun Budja, within which our streams and tributaries flow to join the Great Gulbiyup, the Blackwood River. We recognise and respect that Wadandi and Pilbaramun ancestors and their descendants are the traditional custodians of this country and have a long and continuing connection to this land. Just a few words for newcomers to this webinar. You may have noticed by now that you can hear us and not speak, and that's deliberate so we can keep things moving along at a good pace. You can definitely still ask questions though, so please don't be shy. Just type your question at any time into the chat box and I'll make sure it gets asked either during or at the end of the presentation. Also, if you do run into any technical difficulties, don't stress, because we are recording this webinar and you will be able to watch it later. I'll be emailing it out next week to you. Okay, so now to the reason you have all tuned in today. I am delighted to have talking to us today agroecologist Mark Tupman. For over 2 decades, Mark has been active in the fields of organic and biodynamic production, permaculture, sustainability, agroecology and holistic management. Through his business, Productive Ecology, Mark provides consultation, education and training in the establishment of integrated living production systems. In addition to his consulting work, Mark also works as a project consultant to the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group on a range of soil health related projects, and most recently has become a contributor to conversations in our online community, Talking After Hours. Mark will be talking to us today on the biological principles we can follow and practices we can adopt to make the best use of our natural resources in primary production enterprises. So without further ado, welcome Mark, and I'll hand over to you.
Today we're going to just talk about how we can develop these fertile functional biological systems. I'm just going to skip straight to the next slide. We missed a minute or two, so we'll get on with it. Let the show go on. So yeah, as primary producers, we're straight away in the biological realm because we're in the business of growing living things. So it goes without saying that we're going to be dealing with living organisms on our enterprises and learning how to grow those things. And I'm just going to pose the question, sort of what's most important, even if we are growing, livestock or certain types of plants. We really are in the realm of growing, things like microbes as well, and of course the soil that sort of underpins the health of plants. So they're kind of all interconnected, regardless of what sort of primary production we're in. So it's quite commonly said that or understood that you need really good soil to grow really good plants, but equally true is that without plants and the microbes and the animals that they associate with, soil would be little more than weathered rock particles. So it would sort of look like the sort of sand you get in a desert where there's no plants growing and less microbial activity and animal activity. So that previous photo was of a rock that I took in Margaret River, and you can see that this soil here has descended from that rock, the original parent material, and as a result of the plant material that have grown on that soil over a period of time, you can see there's that dark layer there. And even though it's only kikuyu now, it was probably once a forest system or something. And so, there's been organic activity, roots growing down into that, and we can see that change in the soil color from what that organic activity has done to it. And a bit of crumbliness and a bit of a different structure starting has formed over time as well. So if we're growing living things, it's just breaking it right down to what all living things need. And basically it doesn't matter whether you're a tree or an elephant or the tiniest bacterial cell, we all have a basic requirement for energy that we can use to sort of, grow and run around and all that sort of stuff, and the materials as well to build bodies and organs and all the things that we need. So basically, just to grow, function, and reproduce, we need a source of energy and a source of material. And the energy and materials that we need, obviously, we get from the environment around us, but it's not so easy for every organism to get what they need by themselves. So, like as a human, we would struggle if we went out in the sun to try and catch some energy from the sun. We'd probably end up sunburnt rather than energetic. And the materials that we need, like if we went out and ate some limestone, we'd probably struggle to assimilate it and get the calcium we need. So we get that from our food, but somewhere along the line, there's been organisms involved in capturing that energy from the sun and also acquiring nutrients from the environment. And so there's a range of different groups of different organisms, and they're sort of more specialist at doing these different things. And when groups of organisms live within a community, it enables the organisms within that community to specialize even further and get really good at what they do, because that being in a community enables them to share the resources. And so you don't have to do everything all by yourself. You can rely on the specialists next door, and you can give and take from each other a little bit. And that makes for sort of strong production. So again, whatever we're doing, whatever enterprise we're in, we're going to be managing a range of organisms in a community, even if we're growing livestock or plants or grass or whatever it might be. So this is just a picture of sort of a diagram of an audit that was done on the biomass on this planet a few years ago, and it does keep changing. They adjust it a little bit from time to time because they're constantly finding out more, but the basic sort of idea is the same. The large group of, it was about 550 gigatons, which gigatons a billion, by the way. So there's about 550 gigatons of biomass on this planet. And of that 550, 450 of it is plant material. And then there's also the next biggest group is bacteria. And then we've got things like protists, which includes algae and fungi and archaea. So all of those things are either plants or kind of microorganisms. And then we get down to the last 2 billion, which is animals. And when you split the animals up, your largest groups, the insects and the fish. And then finally you get down to where, the animals that we are and the animals that we manage, and also the wild animals are. So it's quite a small proportion of biomass on this planet is animal matter. And, we really need all that activity with the plants and the bacteria and the fungi and the algae and everything as well to support that animal existence. So, whether it's us or the animals we're raising, we're relying on all of those systems to get us the resources from the environment that we need. And, we say what comes first. I think if we were to say the one thing that would come first, it would be plants and algae, or what we call photoautotrophs. And these are the organisms that are capable of, taking energy from the sun and putting it into a biological form. And that means that once it's in a biological form, all the rest of us can use it. So, cellulose, which is sort of used for the structure of cell walls and things like that, is the most abundant organic molecule on the planet. So carbohydrates, plants, when they photosynthesize, they form carbohydrates. So that's using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water, and the sunlight. And, it makes sense that it's called a carbohydrate when you look at the equation. But the carbohydrate, as we know, is an energy. It's a molecule with a lot of energy stored in it. And, that really is the predominant source of energy for living that we all use. But carbohydrates are also the initial molecules of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, from which other organic materials are built. You sort of bring in other elements and you rearrange the structure of everything, and you get your fats and your proteins and your enzymes and all sorts of things. So it all kind of originates from carbohydrates. So it kind of goes without saying that they're very important. And if you have a look at plant material and just breaking it down a bit, just to further illustrate how everything originates from these carbohydrates. When you look at a living plant, it's made up of 80 to 90% water. And once you dry that up, you're left with the dried plant tissue. 97.5 of that is still made up of these atmospheric elements, the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And it wouldn't matter. I mean, plant matter is sort of, slightly different to animal matter or any other living matter out there, but the basic sort of sort of breakdown is the same. All of us are really carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen predominantly. And then there's these other elements that, the mineral elements that would, originate in the soil, and they're used for major sort of processes in plants like photosynthesis, and also their structural components. And so, you need quite a reasonable amount of them compared to the trace elements, which are more like, they're kind of like these keys. So they're enzyme cofactors, and that means that they are involved in reactions that can be performed over and over again. So, if you turn, the one key could open many doors, and it means that, you only need them in small quantities, but you do need them. They're very important for all the reactions that happen, and so like a catalyst. And obviously, as plants get bigger, you still need them all over the plant. So, the amount that you need as a plant grows increases. But yeah, altogether, they're only making up 0.5% of the total plant matter, and the other elements from the soil are only about 2%. All the rest of it, again, is coming from, atmospheric elements, and that's sort of organic chemistry for you. So these carbohydrates are pretty important, and we all want a piece of them. And they say there's this sort of evolutionary theory, survival of the fittest, but in some ways it's not really the survival of the fittest, it's probably survival of the community or survival of the associates, because it's not just a case of one thing being fit, it's a case of the thing that is living with and around that is making it a successful system. And in the case of plants, they're really relying on other organisms to help them get the things that they need, and in exchange they will supply those carbohydrates, and then those organisms have an energy source and the building blocks to go out and get things from the environment and bring them back to the plant. So these are just some of the the key things that other organisms do. Fix nitrogen, as we know, the nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they're not just the ones that live on plants, but free living ones in the soil as well. And there's microbes that are great at acquiring minerals from the soil environment, mycorrhizal fungi, and all sorts of mineral solubilizing bacteria. There's a whole range of them. The other thing that these microorganisms and various organisms do is assemble useful compounds that benefit the plant. So they might be, vitamins, minerals, enzymes, again, proteins, amino acids, and the plants benefit from this pre-assembled compounds that are delivered to them by microbes, for instance. They deliver nutrition, so they can get nutrients and things from the soil profile, and they can actually bring it to the plants, as in the case of mycorrhizal fungi or just mobile organisms in the soil. They retain and cycle the nutrients in the soil, so obviously they're holding the nutrients in their bodies and cells, but also they're breaking down organic matter that has nutrients sort of fixed within it or trapped, and they're releasing it so that it can be used for plants again to grow. They structure the soil. You've got things like worms and dung beetles making tunnels, and you've got other a byproduct of sort of all the organic matter breakdown, humus, which then coats soil particles and helps them stick together and create aggregates and stability in the soil, and charges to hold onto things. They can modify the soil conditions, so things like pH and the oxidation state. And they also, in terms of useful compounds, they can produce things that help plants with their immunity, and they provide protection, not just compound protection, but also they can, provide physical protection just around the root zone or on the leaves of plants and stop pathogens from coming in and attacking them. And they can work both ways. If a plant's not really giving them what they need, they might turn from a protector into a pathogen themselves, just to make way for a healthier plant, or a plant that grows better in that situation. And then finally, they distribute products and resources. So whether it's nutrients, like in the case of something like manure, but they can also, like distribute something like pollen, which is really important for plants in terms of reproduction. So it's kind of a two-way street, and it's sort of important to understand that both of these processes, it's kind of a balance between the two. And as producers, we need to be aware of that and keep that in check. And a good example would be if we're thinking about how we manage and graze our animals. So, you know, if we were to leave our animals on pasture, a paddock for too long, they're certainly using the available energy. They're eating all the carbon materials, the plant matter, um, you know, and they're turning it into, you know, something like manure, for instance. And then that's, you know, fertility for the plants. But if, you know, because they're eating the plants that are growing, then the capacity to catch energy is limited. And so you start to shortchange yourself on that side of the equation. And then, you know, we get less and less plant matter available, and you know, nothing, there's less for them to cycle and bring back to the plants. And on the flip side, if we were to leave our plant material and not graze it, sometimes the plants might go, you know, through maturity and go rank, and then we start to lose carbon and, you know, the volatile elements through oxidation and you know, high temperatures back to the environment, and we miss out on those as well. So it's kind of a common common sort of principle in a lot of sort of production enterprises, and just understanding that, yeah, at all times we've kind of got to keep both these processes going. And if we can do that, then we end up with a dynamic system, which is where production is happening. And if we're looking at the dynamic system and just looking where most of the business end of things is, where most of that organic production is happening, there's kind of these two sort of cups that we've got here, and where you know, there's really a lot of available energy for the biology is in plant root exudates. So the plants are obviously photosynthesizing, and they're sending sugars, you know, directly to the roots, for instance. And those sugars, you know, they haven't really, not much of them's been used along the way. They've pretty much gone straight from the leaves down to the roots. They're very easy to assimilate, and the nutrients can use this high energy source, and they can quickly go out and get nutrients for the plants or perform services for the plants. And that in return helps the plants to grow better and photosynthesize more. Um, Obviously, a portion of the energy that plants catch, significant portion, is used just to grow the living matter, the leaves and the fruit and all that sort of stuff, the stems. But in the process of growing, you know, some of the energy is spent. Of course, you know, it takes energy for plants to grow, and then, you know, there are animals that might come along, for instance, and eat the plant material, and then to digest that, because now it's not just simple sugars but more complex carbohydrates and cellulose and things like that, they have to spend energy digesting it as well. And obviously the animals use a lot of energy for growing. So there's energy spent in that second part of the equation, and they do return nutrients, obviously, from the digestion byproducts back to the plants, which help growth again, and that's important. But yeah, there's less, in a sense, of organic turnover happening on that part of the equation. And then finally, you know, if we leave our plants to the point where they're going, you know, they die, and, you know, same animal material as well, deceased animal material, a lot of the energy at that stage is gone, and the plant material's lignified, so it's a lot harder to digest, and you need these specialist decomposers to come in, and they will extract the last of the energy left in the plant material, and they will also, yes, again, return minerals back to the plant. And, you know, there will also be some sort of stable humus fraction byproducts maybe at the end of that. And I really wanted to just talk about this, because often when someone will start a garden, for instance, just a home garden, talking about small scale, they'll bring in organic materials to improve the soil fertility. And yes, that is part of the equation, but in a way you are shortchanging yourself, because you're not growing the plants in situ. So you're missing out on that root exudation and you know, animal digestion as well, possibly as well, and how that can really help the fertility of your system. So, I mean, look at that hand, isn't it fantastic? Yes, I'm only kidding. So on that plant there, we can see that it is all happening in that rhizosphere where the root exudates are getting put out, and you can see that there's a whole lot of soil stuck to the roots, and, you know, that's the result of not just the sticky sugars the plants are putting out, but all the byproducts from the microbes and their metabolic sort of, you know, waste products as well. So there's like sort of gels and sticky sort of substances and jellies, and they're also literally binding things together, and, you know, their mucus and various films. So that's really sort of creating a unique world in itself just beneath the plants there. and it's quite different to the bulk soil. You might find the pH is different in there. The water holding capacity is different, and it just provides the plant roots with, they're actually sort of managing between them and the microbes. They're managing that environment so it's more suitable for growth, and it's also going to be able to withstand, changes in the outside environment. So it's evident now that plants are actively cultivating microbes internally on their surfaces, in the stems, in the leaves, in the flowers, in the soils, and doing that to acquire nutrients and also just modulate their growth and development. So some of the things that they'll be using microbes for is to help them, initiate root hair development, or there's a range of things, and obviously improving their health again, of course. And you can see there an image of sort of an ancient sort of maize plant, or variety of maize plant, and it's got these really sticky exudates that it's putting out, and you can see quite a lot of it's sugar. So any inos is sort of a sugar-based, carbohydrate-based substance, and then there's some amino acids in there as well. And among other things, they are predominantly probably hosting or attracting and using nitrogen from nitrogen fixing bacteria. So this is just happening in the air. But the kookaburra agrees. No doubt in the soil there'll be exudation going on as well, and similar processes and other microbes involved. And I think we've all aware that legumes that host these rhizobium that fix nitrogen. There's the nodules on the roots, so the plants are actually not only feeding the microbes, but they're also providing a house for them as well. But equally, there's free living nitrogen fixing bacteria around the roots and in the bulk soil, and also just in organic litter that are fixing nitrogen as well. So yep, there's plenty of these diatotrophs all over the show. Bacteria are a very nitrogen rich organism. And then we've got mycorrhizal fungi. Wonderful stuff. They, they're connected to the plant roots, the filaments or the hyphae of the mycorrhizal fungi, and they're really extending the root system dramatically, and also the surface area, because mycorrhizal fungal hyphae is very fine, so it can really get into all the nooks and crannies in the soil and wrap itself around particles and get to places that plant roots can't. And it's also very good at releasing strong acids that solubilize minerals, and there's bacterial films or water films that line this hyphae, and you'll see bacteria, mineral solubilizing bacteria shooting up and down this fungal highway. They're obviously taking sugar out from the roots into the soil and bringing nutrients back to the plants. So yeah, really improving the capacity of a plant root to acquire things that it needs from the soil. Great networking. And then we get into Rhizophagy, which some of us have heard of before. It's sort of relatively new discoveries, and mostly pioneered by someone by the name of James White. And it's fascinating stuff. So we now know that plants are microbivores. So Rhizophagy, plant microbivory, that is actually a word. And you can see here this bacteria has been stained, and it is getting taken, it's going into the plant roots. You can actually see the color, the blue color in the plant roots. And so, it used to be thought that plants were only taking up ionic nutrients, but now we know that plants can take up, whole compounds, proteins, and in this case, whole bacteria. And it's a pretty impressive process. They create a sort of bit of an indent in the cells that line the root tips, and then ingest these bacteria. And then once the bacteria inside the cell, they close it off, so they're stuck in there, and they release these superoxides that basically remove the bacterial membrane. And the bacterial membrane is a really rich source of what they call amino sugars, so protein and sugar, which is just what we all want. And also the metabolites that are in the bacterial cells get released into the plant cell. And when you think of cellular metabolites, they're pretty rich things. Like a cell has a membrane, so it can create quite a rich environment inside that's different to the outside environment, and it can assemble lots of compounds, greater concentrations of nutrients, and all those things. So these bacteria have acquired all this from the soil. They've brought it into the plant, and now they're being ingested and releasing it into plant cells. And then once the plants have sort of done this process where they've got rid of the membranes and that they've extracted the metabolites from the bacteria, they spit the DNA of the bacteria back out into the soil, and that initiates the formation of a root hair, which you'll often see on footage of a plant root tip growing, and the root hair that follows just behind it. So all this action is happening, around the root tips. And that, of course, increases the surface area of plant roots dramatically as well, having all these root hairs everywhere and all the things that live around that. And they even take some of the bacteria and distribute it up to other parts of the plant to do jobs for them in even above ground, so in the leaves, stems, and finally also deposit bacteria in the seed, so that when the seed drops and starts to grow again the next season or whenever it might be, it's already got this bacterial community ready to go, and they start the rhizophagy process all over again. And it's particularly important, for young plants. It can be really the major source of nutrition for young plants, because the portion of root tips in young plants, of course, is greater because they're just developing new roots. And then we get to animals. I had to have a picture of that on there, didn't I? So animals perform a whole range of functions. They don't really acquire nutrients. That's sort of more the microbial domain, but they're certainly performing a whole lot of other things, functions that are really beneficial for plants, and they certainly help with cycling of nutrients. So one of the things they do is consume species that aren't performing well, so they make the resources available for something else that might grow better in that situation. Like we talked about, a beneficial organism can turn into a pathogen if the plant's not really providing what it needs. And we'll often see that. I see it all the time in the veggie garden, for instance, when I plant healthy seedlings that have grown in good compost, for instance, compared to seedlings that I got from the shop or somewhere where the biological sort of system in the roots wasn't as strong and it's not as healthy, and you'll plant it in the garden and some pest will come along and make short work of it while the other one next to it is growing really well. And I saw this recently too that was quite stark. We obviously have a big problem with red-legged earth mite at a certain time of year, around about when we're planting nice young crops. And I had some healthy pasture that I planted some into, and some cover crops in this case. And there was also some where they dug out a dam and let it sit for a while, the topsoil. So it was actually originally the topsoil, but it had sat for long enough that there was really not much biological activity going on in that for a while. And so the soil had lost its structure, and there just wasn't as much life going on, and that got spread. And at the same time as we seeded the normal pasture, we seeded this area where the dam spread was, this original topsoil. And the red-legged earth mites didn't touch the stuff that was growing on the healthy pasture, where there was still lots of sort of soil structure and good biological activity. But on this dam spread, it absolutely got hammered, and it was like chalk and cheese. So in that case, the insects, as much as we don't like red-legged earth mites, they were probably getting rid of something that probably wasn't going to grow well there anyway, to some degree, because the soil just wasn't suitable for that type of species. They're also really good at regulating vegetative growth. Like if you're getting maturing plant material, sometimes having a graze from an animal, especially if it's perennial sort of species, can really initiate a pulse, another growth pulse, and just keep that photosynthesis happening rather than letting the plant sort of slow down and go reproductive. They're really good at turning over organic materials. I mean, you think of digestion, they're eating grass and cellulose and things like that, lignin sometimes, and they're, out the other end, you're getting this manure, which is full of soluble nutrients that are available for plants again, and high in nitrogen and sometimes things like potassium and stuff. They incorporate organic materials. So whether it's livestock, literally, stomping down vegetation and just sort of pushing it into the soil, or whether you've got something like a dung beetle or an earthworm, and they're going up and down and taking organic materials through the soil profile. And just on that matter, you've got the dung beetles and the worms also structuring the soil. They're going up and down, creating channels, and that's letting air and water in and gases out. And there's also, obviously these humus products, which we'll talk about in a sec, which line the soil particles and help them crumb together. And that, allows, again, air and water to move in and out of the soil. Um, they deposit fertility through the landscape. One thing about animals is they can move, so they're pretty good at moving things around. And like we said before, you know, you've got insects and birds and mammals and all sorts of things that will pollinate plants as well. And then we get onto the decomposers, the last in the line, and they are, you know, really just there to break down all those residual materials. There's a huge different amount of species that get involved in this, and there is still energy obviously left in the residual materials. You know that because you could burn wood chips or straw. Still got quite a bit of energy left in it, and they take advantage of that. And in the process of breaking down these materials, they of course release these nutrients again, and then they have these other byproducts of the decomposition process, which includes humus, which we'll talk about in a bit, and also all these biochemicals that, you know, they're metabolites and things like that that are known to stimulate more sort of activity, plant growth, and, you know, trigger things like root exudation as well. So talking about humus, there's been, you know, we've sort of been trying to understand humus for a while, but as far as we can work out now, that it is just these minute fractions of organic matter that have been broken down and broken down and broken down by various populations of organisms until they're pretty much, have used all the energy that's left, and they're resistant to further decomposition. And there's multiple pathways. It's not just, you know, respiration. There might be fermentation involved and all these different things by different populations. So not all of it's releasing the carbon, and you end up with these minute carbon fractions, predominantly made up of, yeah, the leftovers from all these microbial populations eating each other. And the thing about humus is it's so small, it has a lot of surface area and it has a charge as well. And it naturally sticks to the particles in the soil that also have charge. So you'll have, yeah, humus lining the soil particles, and they create these very stable organo-mineral complexes that's kind of like cementing together. And these persist in the soil for long periods of time. So when we talk about long-lasting carbon and sequestering carbon for a long period of time, this is kind of what we've come to. This is the definition of long-term carbon, soil carbon. And humus colloids have a much higher holding capacity than, say, clay, which is famous for having a, you know, a high cation exchange capacity. So it's a negative charge that holds onto the positive nutrients in our soil. Humus colloids have, you know, a lot more charge than clay, for instance. So you can, there's immense holding capacity, and that it has fractions that can hold on to anions as well as cations. So it can hold on to negatively charged ions like boron and sulfur and nitrate, things that would normally leach quite easily in the soil. And so that's really handy, as well as cations that, like the clay does, like calcium and magnesium and potassium. In the soil, the humus coats and binds these clusters of fine soil particles together, and that's the beginning of aggregation. They form these micro aggregates, little crumbs. And then, yeah, what happens is that the things like fungi and worms and all that, even plant roots, will sort of combine these micro aggregates and sort of cluster them up together, wrap around them and join them and make macro aggregates, which are the bigger crumbs. And inside these macro aggregates, it's just a really contained environment. I'll speak a bit more about it in a sec, but I just wanted to show you this rather crude diagram because you can see the fungal hyphae, which is quite fine, the mycorrhizal hyphae, and that's weaving in and out between all these particles and micro aggregates and through that whole colloid, or that humus aggregate, that aggregate, sorry. And then you can see the plant root, which is rather big and coarse. So, you know, it's quite a difference between something like fungal hyphae and a plant root in terms of what it can access and get to and extract. So like I said, these other organisms are forming these macro aggregates, binding together particles and organic materials and micro aggregates. And inside an aggregate, you know, it's obviously quite a contained environment full of all this gels and saccharides and all these things, that these organic compounds, and, you know, really good at, it's like jelly holding onto moisture, colloidal sort of environment. And the state of the nutrients too, because, you know, it's not an oxidized environment inside an aggregate. So the state of the nutrients, certain nutrients, is much more plant available, and they remain stable in these aggregates, even though the season might be dry and hot outside. it's got a different sort of world going on inside there. And the gaps between the aggregates, again, enable water and air to move down into the soil, and carbon dioxide released through decomposition. You know, organisms just like us, they breathe in oxygen to burn fuel and get their energy, and they release carbon dioxide. And, you know, we know that especially dicots, which tend to have more horizontal leaves, have most of their stomates, that's the holes in their leaves, on the underside of their leaves. And that is to take advantage of the carbon dioxide that's coming out of the soil. And, you know, it's a higher concentration than the atmospheric carbon dioxide. And, you know, like in controlled growing environments, we're really trying to increase carbon dioxide levels. It can be a limiting factor for photosynthesis. So these plants have evolved with strong, you know, biological activity in the soils, and that's why they have these stomates on the underside of the leaves. Plant species that have more vertical leaves will have a more even distribution of stomata between the top and the bottom. So things like your monocots, like grasses or onions, for instance, are not so different between, you know, the under and the top of the leaves. The decaying plant roots and, you know, larger soil microbes and animals also create channels for air and water, as we talked about. The decaying plant roots, just a special mention, they're quite a system. I mean, you think about it, you've got a big root in there that's spreading out through the soil, and then when that plant dies and it starts to break down, there's this channel, and if water sort of happens to enter sort of where the crown once was, it can literally trickle down these pathways where the plant roots once were, and sort of basically sort of seep into the surrounding environment of what was once a plant root, which tends to be a rich environment because there's organisms breaking down the root and there's all that organic material in there, but it was once the rhizosphere, so it's probably pretty aggregated and already got a lot of, you know, holding capacity, and a bit like a sponge. So that water, that system is just really good. You can literally distribute it through the soil profile into where it stores best and keep those nice aggregated environments saturated. Unlike dirt, you know, in a desert soil, there's structure in living soils, so it really makes materials far less prone to being washed or blown away. And, you know, the first things that are going to get blown away or washed away are, you know, the really fine dusts and particles and stuff in the soil, and they're often the ones that we really don't want blowing away. They're pretty important for the whole fertility and charge and everything in our soil. So this is just a picture. I took it because it was an area where we had a garden, and spent a lot of time just, you know, working on the soil and doing some of the things we're going to talk about in the next section. And at some point, the garden had to be shut down. And like, you know, seeds and garlic, you can't just store them for years. You've got to plant them every season. And even though the retic and everything had been shut off, I just had to put my garlic in, knowing that it wasn't going to get watered that season. And obviously you plant it in the winter or the autumn when it is still raining, but it dries out pretty chronically in spring, and I just hoped it would hold on enough to put some bulbs on. And round about this time of year, just sort of into December, I went to dig it out. It had bulbed. It wasn't as fantastic maybe as it would have been with water, but what was really impressive was when I dug it out, despite the fact it hadn't rained for months, you know, there was moisture in the soil and there was this crumbliness, and you can see these fine filaments of, you know, fungi and all sorts of stuff, and a few little critters just running around in there. So it was just a testament to all the work we'd done improving that soil environment and how well it held on to the moisture through time. That's sort of just, that was kind of some of the underlying principles, and, you know, just giving you some insight into all these wonderful things that biology is doing all the time. And now I just wanted to talk about some of the sort of practices that we can adopt that can help us with this. And, you know, obviously I'm using the word functional diversity because we're specifically using or managing organisms that perform functions for the system and for us and for our productivity. And so let's just talk about some of those. And as we said in the beginning of the presentation, you know, plants or photosynthesis is where it all begins. But understanding that the plant kingdom is really diverse, and that the different species, different families, different types of plants all host different types of organisms and associate with different animal populations above the soil and so on. And so if we want to recruit, you know, these different organisms that perform these services for plant nutrition and fertility, we do need to use a different diversity of different plants. And, for instance, we understand the legumes will host the Rhizobium, which will fix the nitrogen. Some species are really good at hosting mycorrhizal fungi. Others don't. So, you need both of those in there, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, basically plant diversity is really what drives this microbial and animal diversity above and below the ground. And when we've got that diversity, it means we've got better access. The microbes can produce resources, get things, carry out services that are important, and that it enables an efficient sort of and widespread exchange of goods and services. So basically, the community as a whole, the plants and all the microbes that are there, and all the inherent traits they bring to the table, are what's going to aid in the productivity of the whole system. So one of the practices, obviously, that is becoming very popular for good reason is the use of multi-species cover crops. And these obviously have got a range of different species in there, annual species, so we can use them within, cropping systems. Often they're annual species in the cover crops, that is. And so, they're there for a good time, not necessarily a long time, but they perform a lot of services for us. And, on a seasonal basis, we can use them. And, there's been plenty of these sort of images shown since we've started using these multi-species cover crops. And, I always like to test things out. So this was just a garden where we started. We had a blank template and, wanted to sow some cover crops. Used to just sow green manures with 1 or 2 species, but this time put probably about a 5-way mix in there. And there was peas and grasses and some brassicas and stuff. And at the same time, I sort of also started planting some separate beds, and I made sure to plant the peas at the same time as I planted the cover crop, just so I could see how they went. And as you can see, it's quite a stark difference. They just really struggled in this environment growing by themselves. I didn't obviously give any fertilizer or any special treatment to either of them, but obviously where there was a diversity of species growing, they were sharing resources. There was organisms in there that were doing things that the peas couldn't do by themselves. And then they were, obviously bartering and helping each other out. And the whole system was doing better. The microbes were really happy. At the same time, I did test the soil at the beginning. It was because it was a blank template. I used it for quite a few trials. And when I say blank template, that means the soil conditions were pretty much the same across the board. There hadn't been any practices in one area that were different to another prior to that. And yeah, based on the soil test, we tried a range of fertilizers. We were kind of it was a demonstration garden, and we were trying to establish some data to help a community that was starting up. And what I noticed, it's hard to tell which of these photos had the fertilizer. A lot of people guess that they think it's the one on the top left-hand side, but actually the one that got the fertilizer was on the bottom right-hand side. They didn't really look that different, to be honest. It was just probably the light in the day that made one look a little bit greener than the other. But the lesson I learned was that maybe if you want to do fertilizer trials, don't do them with diverse cover crops, because the effect of the fertilizer will be less obvious, because the cover crops seem to grow quite well in this situation, regardless of whether it had fertilizer or not. This is just a picture from a farmer in Katanning called Simon Sims. He also grows lots of, he started growing some cover crops, and this is from 2 seasons of cover cropping. He's showing the dark soil after 2 seasons of these annual cover crops, and just the color difference and the structural difference that was starting to appear from that. And that really is the difference in that soil in terms of how it's going to perform, and the amount of humus in there is going to be quite significant. Look at that hand again. This time it's not mine. So one thing I wanted to say about these annual sort of seed species and why they're so good at improving your soil is that they're quite expensive seeds that they have to produce. You're thinking of oil seeds and legumes with the high protein seed, or cereals, high starch seeds. And so the plants spend a lot of their, they've got a short season, and they really prime the soil. They send a lot of root exudates down there and get that whole biological delivery network and service network really going, so that when the time comes that they have to produce a seed, they've got all that in place, and they can actually, gather the resources they need to make these expensive seeds. So these annual seed crops in particular are really popular for, soil building. And This is a video I had. I'm not going to show it to you because there's problems with the presentation, but it basically was showing the infiltration after some of these cover crops and all those decaying roots and how well the water went into it compared to the area just next to it. I'm just going to have to take my word for it this time. So just some quick tips on planting multi-species cover crops in our area. Obviously, we're a Mediterranean environment, so in early autumn we've got rainfall on the way, and so that's really important. After the dry summer, there isn't an active stand of weeds growing that we have to deal with, so we've got a blank slate for planting. If we miss that and we have got weeds in place, weed management is really important. And some people think you can just plant cover crops and not give them the kind of treatment you'd give other crops or vegetables in your garden, for instance. You just wouldn't plant them amongst the weeds. So it's really important that you do actually have a weed management plan in place. And some of the strategies that you could use include things like dry seeding before the weeds germinate with the first rains of the season, when everything's kind of dead, and then at least they germinate at the same time as the weeds. And a lot of these things that we're growing are pretty competitive if they get a good start and they grow really densely and sort of outcompete the weeds quite well. But alternatively, if you miss the break, you can carry out some sort of weed control with some sort of shallow cultivation or herbicide application. Obviously, the longer you leave it, the bigger the weeds, the more you're going to have to dig that soil or plow it if you're going to use cultivation to get rid of them, and they can kind of get in the way of the seeder, and it just gets more challenging. And also that your window for the conditions start to get colder and wetter. And if you're planting late and you're doing that sort of soil prep, you're really exposing your soil to the potential damage from the heavy rain that's coming as well. So it's good to get that cover crop in early, get it growing, protecting the soil. And this is just a list of some of the things that are commonly used in these mixes: autumn, cool season, annual mixes. I won't go through them individually, but they're there for reference. And then something sort of a little bit different to cover cropping. It's sort of more about multi-species pastures. Obviously, we're in down here. A lot of us are in the game of livestock, and just wanted to say that there are a couple of trade-offs when you're establishing multi-species pastures. It's a little bit different to your standard pastures that are designed to be grazed really frequently, and a bit harder than some of these species are. And it's understanding that the cover crop or the multi-species that you're growing are there for a number of reasons, aside from just giving that diversity and pasture health, and ultimately, a pretty good forage, even if you can't graze it as often, that they can put on some biomass, but also in terms of improving your soil and recruiting all those microbes, basically, that we were talking about, and animals to do those wonderful functions that then maybe can spare us on things like fertilizer costs or herbicides and things like that as well. So there might be a trade-off in our initial amount of grazing pressure that we can apply, but there's also these fringe benefits. So it's looking at the whole picture and understanding too that it might take a number of seasons. Like you might have to work on improving your soil a bit before you can get some of these things to actually grow. Otherwise, the red-legged earth mites or some other thing might just take them out. So you might spend time improving your soil so that it holds water better and it functions better, and it supports these sort of higher plants that are quite edible for animals better, as well as that slipped my mind. Just something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. Anyway, if it comes to me, I'll say it again. So these are just some of the standard species that we would use in annual pastures around here. And as you can see, it's a little bit less diverse. There's sort of 3 families in there. We'd like to see more. Beets and brassicas technically are a slightly different family, but very sort of similar in their function. And traditionally we'd probably see more just your ryegrass, clover pastures around here. But these species here are, they're very graze tolerant, and there's no reason why we couldn't maybe expand that list just a little bit if we learn how to manage the other species in there. So things like chicory and plantain, which are more perennial, might work quite well in amongst these species if we just enable them the time to get established and graze things right. So talking about perennials, obviously they've got to survive over the hot, long, dry summer here. So if we can get our soil to the stage where they put on some really good growth in their first wet season, and then the soil also holds enough moisture in the dry season for them to survive their first summer, then that's pretty important. they're notoriously slow to get going. So especially the perennial grasses, and they don't fare well with competition. So ironically, if we are trying to establish perennials in some way, we might actually need to reduce our fast-growing, high-producing sort of pasture species like ryegrass. So, you know, the ryegrass will definitely grow a lot faster than the perennial grasses. It needs grazing more regularly. And yeah, we might actually have to sort of do something or choose paddocks to establish perennials where we are actually not actively growing lots of ryegrass, or even possibly controlling the ryegrass to set the scene for those perennials to take off. We can use annual crops in the preceding seasons to improve the soil, just like we talked about the cover crops, and just that might set the scene, outcompete some of the weeds, improve the soil, and just make it a bit better for perennial species down the track. So this is what I was talking about when I was saying that it might take a couple of seasons to establish a multi-species pasture. We also need to allocate longer periods of time between graze events with the perennial species. They generally require more time for recovery than the species that we've naturally picked for pasture because we can graze them more often. So, and you know, that's not necessarily a loss because even though you can't graze them as often, they are putting on biomass all that time that you're not grazing them. And the more leaf surface area they have, the faster they grow. They just tend not to start to go yellow on the lower leaves quite as quick as a ryegrass would, for instance. And so they're still putting on really good growth for longer periods of time. And obviously they really are handy when you get to the dry times of the year because they hang on for longer and they come back really fast as soon as you get wet weather, which is really important as well because often annual species are just germinating and the perennials have that sort of, you know, they've got that storage in their crowns and their root systems and they will shoot away fast. They give us really good early feed when it's just getting going in the season. So that they're really crucial for those windows where we actually have these sort of points that are a bit more challenging. So that's just a picture of one. That's a plantain plant. Probably left a bit long. You can see it's really ready for grazing in that first picture on the left. And then, you know, we graze it and then leave it for a period of time to grow back again. And that was probably a good couple of months before that last picture was taken. But there you see it's nice and green and the pasture around it's drying off. So probably could have grazed it a bit sooner than that. It was going yellow on the bottom leaves by that stage. And there's other indicators as to what's going to say it's recovered. But in this case, it was well and truly ready for grazing. But it did take a bit longer. These are just some of the species that might be available in this area, perennial species that you can seed. Not all of them are going to work in all areas, but you know they're sort of things that are available and people are growing in different places in this environment. And I just really wanted to show you this. This was from a friend of ours, Cam Banks. He sent through some photos. It's from a book from 1955 and just showing a sort of herbal ley, which really is just basically forage in a pasture. And it's showing a whole range of different species that they might use in a kind of, sort of dry, hard soil. And, these deep root systems get down there and survive. And, it just shows sort of there's lots of opportunities and we could be a bit more creative. And this next picture is just an example of, maybe something that would work as well. There's I'm sure plenty of these, but I just had if anyone's ever grown artichokes before, you know they tend to persist. You don't have to plant them again. And so they're a perennial species. And I was cleaning up this area. It still had some remnant artichokes in it, obviously. And you can just see how much the sheep loved it. They were barely in there for a minute and they'd just devoured it. The good news is that artichoke is still alive and kicking underneath that soil. And in autumn, that is going to jump out of the ground again. They do naturally go dormant in summer anyway. So, yeah. Good tucker. And taking perennials to the next level, you've got fodder trees. So, if you can, you obviously have to give trees a long time to establish before you can graze them, much longer, years. So you do have to kind of protect them during establishment, but once they get to a certain size, you can, they can be grazed, and also you can just sort of have them inside fence lines and things like that along the edge of paddocks, and that, provides great food again in summer for the animals. And they're bringing up water and nutrients from deep in the ground. So anything that's leached over time gets cycled back to the surface. It's really nutrient-rich food for the animals as well. Sometimes you'll find them eating the bark if they're nutrient deficient. So yeah, that's one thing you've got to watch out for. But basically trees, yeah, very valuable. And there's lots of different tree systems that are used in grazing. you know, in the syntropic movement or silver pasture and all that sort of thing. And all those systems have got some great ways of integrating trees into sort of a livestock system. And I don't think anyone who uses them regrets it. They're also a source of shade for animals in summer, which is really important around here because they're eating quite high fiber food, getting quite hot. And, you know, especially things like sheep, they definitely need some shade. So just talking a little bit quickly about our herbivores. I'm trying not to rush, keeping an eye on the time here. It's ticking fast. So I like to think, I feel that what's best for the livestock health and production is also what's best for pasture composition and growth and the soil health. In nature, we've got examples of animals everywhere in these healthy ecosystems, large herds, and, you know, really luscious and diverse pasture and really good soil health. And just some quick points on that. So obviously, when we're talking about mob grazing, we're talking about, you know, trying to emulate what's happening in nature, where you've really got animals bunched up together. And some of the principles behind this, and, you know, obviously it's all going to be different based on what you can actually manage, but we want to try and avoid selective grazing where we can, which is when the animals have too much choice, they're not bunched up too close and they've got a big paddock, they will go in and they will eat the best plants first, and so eat them out. And, you know, obviously those plants will start to regrow it within a few days, possibly, and they will go back and they will keep grazing those again and again. So selecting them over the less desirable species that we want, and then we end up with pastures that are full of cakeweed or dock or things that we don't really want and don't provide that high quality forage for us. The other thing about bunching them and not giving them such a wide area and choice is they don't just eat the tops of the plant, but they'll eat down further and eat some of that stem as well. And that gives them a good, especially here in the cool green season, forage is really sugary and high in protein, and, you know, they tend to get scours. So forcing them to eat a bit more of that stem, which otherwise would go to waste because you move them on and, you know, there is some leafy growth that comes back out of that stem again. But the next time you bring them into graze, that stem is even less palatable for them, the old stem. So the more we can sort of take that out of the equation and they get a better balance of food. And obviously, if you leave them in a big area for a long time, they're going to eat the green stuff first, and then they're going to be stuck on the fibrous stuff for the last, you know, phase of their grazing, and that's not good for utilization at all in terms of them putting, you know, keeping their condition and so on. They evenly distribute the manure and urine if they're bunched up rather than walking the perimeters and gathering in certain areas. Minimize compaction if you're, you know, moving them on quicker because they eat it all a lot faster. And yeah, again, like I say, you avoid grazing regrowth, and because you're getting better utilization and eating more of the plants in one event, you can sort of slow your rotations down, which give your grazed plants more time for recovery. And that means that we can, you know, maybe establish more diverse pasture species and more perennials in the system if we've got these longer recovery events. Just the last little thing on something that I think is really important. And here I'm just talking about what's a practice that I think has got a lot of merit. And it's kind of combining a few of the things that we've already talked about in the presentation. So often, you know, when we're talking about livestock and in our productive systems, we're always focused on the production first and foremost. But there is all this stuff going on in the background that supports it, our resource base. And we really need to look at it holistically and take care of that. And you know, I was born in Africa. It was very rare to see any field looking like our pastures are here. There was generally a lot of diversity and quite long grass in a lot of places. And you know, basically, what I'm proposing is that we can actually leave portions of our green season feed to go all the way through to seed. And what this does is it creates a lot of biomass, very vegetative for the first part of the season. But that biomass ultimately is quite lignified, so it's quite resistant to breaking down. It creates really good cover and habitat and food for the life below the ground in the hot, dry season. And that's, you know, often our paddocks are looking pretty bare and exposed at that time of year, and everything's oxidizing away, all the good work that happened over the cool season. It also allows desirable species to go to seed. And so we could, you know, if we seed a cover crops, for instance, especially one that's got lots of, you know, good things like legumes and everything, and we let it go to seed, it means we've got a seed bank in our soil. So that's going to keep coming back for a few years after that. It means the plants can develop really extensive root systems and build soil at depth. It provides us with a cheaper source of non-growing season feed because we don't have to make hay with it. You can make hay, and obviously that's part of the strategy too, but in this case, you don't have to, or you could create standing hay at times as well. But especially when we use legume species, they're a bit higher in protein, and that would be the limiting factor in the summer. So if you do grow, let things go, stockpile, you may have to supplement with a bit of protein just so they get their minimum protein requirements. But they can utilize all that forage, that high fiber forage as well. It also gives us a source of fiber at the beginning of the growing season. So when the new growth is low at the beginning of the break, and it's high in sugar, and you don't really want to graze your paddocks, you want to give it time to establish, you can use your stockpiled paddocks just to kind of, as a sort of place to put the stock, so you're allowing your other paddocks to establish, and they get a bit of a mix of the fiber from the stockpile, and also some of the new growth, which is high in sugar and protein. So it's quite a balanced feed. And because there's a lot of material in there and there's a bit of mulch that they stomp on the ground, it still protects your soil quite well. And when you do grow a stockpile paddock, they really come away the next growing season because of all that mulch and the seed and everything. So they really provide good green grazing seed food the following season. So you can rotate your paddocks, obviously, and you wouldn't do stockpile in the same paddock every season, but definitely something you could chuck in the mix and do in a few paddocks. Just give it a go and start to play with the idea, because it does really build good soil and sets the scene. That's just a picture of a stockpile paddock on a farm that I manage at the moment. And yeah, we'll bring the animals in there and they'll stomp it down, get all that seed on the ground and all that material, and they're actually getting some of the things you would naturally supplement them with in summer anyway. So all the seeds in there, like all the legume seeds and the oil seeds of the brassicas, and all the other grass seeds and cereal seeds are in there as well. So in some ways you are actually growing your supplements in situ too, or you can do, depending on what species you choose. On our farms, we can cultivate some useful cultures, or we can use cultures to make materials that are very useful. Obviously, if you've got waste products like, from yards and things like that, to actually turn it into a product that's enhanced, a value-added product is a good strategy, because you can do a lot of good things with some good compost or vermiculture or vermicasts. There's just a picture of a Johnson Sioux. Very easy system because you don't have to turn it. It really self-manages, and it's sort of a bit foolproof, but still creates really quality compost at the end, really quality mature compost. And I'll tell you a bit about how to use that in a bit. And then we've got our bioferments, which is more of a, you're culturing a certain groups of organisms that are more the fermenters, things like you'd use in sauerkraut, a lot of lactic bacteria and yeasts and things, and they can have a role and be very beneficial in certain instances as well. And they all kind of chelate and release these organic acids that help with a lot of things too, making minerals available in the soil and putting them in the right form and so on. The plant endophytes, which we talked a lot about at the beginning, so the Rhizophagy and the Mycorrhizal fungi, these sort of things, they live on living plants. They need the living plants to be active, but when the living plants, say annuals that we're talking about, go dormant, then they reproduce, and a lot of their reproductive material is in the roots and the seeds, and the soil around the plant roots. Commercial inoculants can be used to introduce them, as we know with Rhizobium again, or you can use Mycorrhizal fungi inoculants and various things that may or may not have a benefit to you. But if your soil is deficient in those species and you're growing the plants that need them, then inoculation is a good strategy. Just remembering that different plant species host different populations, so it's matching your inoculants with the species. But the shotgun approach would be to, grow diverse cover crops, for instance. And a lot of the things in these diverse cover crops, like the peas, the beans, the clovers, as well as the sorghums, millets, sunflowers, they host a wide range of Rhizobium and Mycorrhizal species. And then, those fields are basically, you're just really boosting the populations of those. And you could actually technically spread some of that soil to areas that haven't got good bacterial populations as well, or mycorrhizal populations. So just a great way of just naturally improving your soil sort of bacterial and fungal populations. And then of course the tree species also host ectomycorrhizal fungi, which is a bit different again. We're getting close to the end now, folks. Goes without saying that we all need a good start in life. So this is some ways we can use biological things like compost or vermicastings. In a fertile environment, generally seeds fall through the litter, and they sort of tend to germinate in that quite high humusy, sort of composty duff layer beneath the litter. which is, just a great environment for seeds to germinate. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot of biostimulant sort of compounds and materials in there. And as a result, all of these different things we talked about, like colonization of the roots, the Rhizophagy cycle, Mycorrhizal sort of, colonization, all of those things can really get going from the get-go. And that means your roots have those protective coverings and those good environments, and just gets things off to a good start, which is really important. And again, I just do little backyard trials all the time. The one on the left had a couple of treatments of compost extract at the very beginning, and I was pretty sporadic with my watering. And when it got a bit dry, the ones on the right that didn't get the compost extract yellowed off. So I assume that the ones on the left definitely had a better, rhizosheaths, better root, sort of the soil was clinging around them and that nice environment. Same thing here. This was just some peas, and all I did with these ones was get some compost, make a slurry, and just chuck a little bit of rock phosphate in there, some clay type minerals, and made a slurry, and then just rolled the pea seed in it and then planted them. And yeah, you can see quite a big difference in the expression. I just use garden soil for the potting mix, so I'm doing it in my context to see what works in my context. There are a lot of biostimulants you can get your hands on. Some you can, obviously just readily available in your actual environment, and these all have their place. I would say that you're not adding micro biostimulants to drive you, to actually literally, they don't provide the nutrition. These are things that stimulate biological activity. They don't work on their own. They're part of a system, and generally they work, in tandem with microbes you've got or you're culturing, as well as the plants. So often they're used, early in the cycles, just to get microbial activity really up and pumping. And they can also be used for things like chelation. There's, obviously organic acids being produced in the soil all the time, and a lot of these biostimulants are things like organic acids, amino acids, and you can use them, in combination with nutrients, for instance, just to help those nutrients get into a good state for plant availability. And all of these biostimulants, when you look down that list, they were originally produced by living things. So once again, they are byproducts of living activity, and they are, so, life begets more life. This is just a picture of it was a cover crop, actually, hay from a cover crop. And I was just doing some trials on, trying to see if I could get better breakdown. And so I did a few strips where I laid out some hay, and I put various biostimulants on this one, which seemed to perform the best. I had a combination of fish hydrolysate and actually manure, just fresh manure from the animals, the cows that were in the paddock next door, put into like a water slurry. Whether it was the nutrients, the nitrogen and the carbon factor that helped it break down sooner or get that colonization happening, or whether it was the biostimulation factor of, the fish and the microbes, maybe even in the manure, because they're coming from a digesting animal anyway that eats straw. Hard to say, but either way, there was a lot more biological activity happening there. So we're sort of coming to the end now, and what I want to say is that with all these strategies we've talked about, you could combine them, and that's when you really start to see some good effects. So we might, for instance, choose to seed a cover crop, and we would use something like compost extract at the beginning to, just help if we need it in the field, plant it early in autumn. And we could, in this, I'm just going to talk through some of the examples I've showed you. We could just say it was a high legume cover crop. We could let it go through all the way to seed, not graze it, let some really good lignified organic matter get produced, also create seed for the next season's cover crop. And then at some point in summer, we might come and graze it with the animals just for some summer feed, but they'll also stomp it down onto the ground and put that mulch and seed in contact with the soil. And then the following autumn, we might let it, really grow. And this time, at some point, we will graze it in the green season, and really with our grazing focus on something like maybe getting rid of all the seed that's in, especially the ryegrass, and maybe some of the seed that's in this cover crop species as well, so that we can set the scene for the following season to seed perennial plants. And in the process, we've improved the soil drastically. You'll see that this happens when we do the stockpiling, but then also by priority grazing it in the green season, we further improve it. And we really set the scene so that the following autumn, we could maybe go in there. We've got less weeds, we've got really good soil, we've still got some residual organic matter breaking down. And then, once again, we could say dry seed some perennial species in there, and they, fingers crossed, if we have a good season and it's not so dry like this year, they might do quite well. This is the last slide. Basically, whatever you do, whether you're sort of actively trying to improve, your biological sort of production in your system, there's some basic principles and things that we would, just keep in mind all the time. So that's just, keeping your soil covered, as we know, with living plants, diversity of organisms and functional things. Using, the synthetic stuff that, wisely, so that we don't, sort of hinder the biological development in our systems, and that can include fertilizers as well. So just being aware of the impact they have and how we use them. Obviously, compaction is a big no-no, so how we manage our livestock and our traffic. And tillage, obviously loosening up the soil when it's really compact can have a real place and help us get going. Just like fertilizers can really help us grow things when the soil is poor and get the biology happening. But as your system gets more developed, your need for heavy tillage and your need for things like fertilizers really diminishes, because the biology is doing all that work of structuring your soil and making nutrients available and cycling things. So yeah, it's one of those things that it has its place, but also we've got to look at how we manage it and try and get the biology more active in the scene. And we've talked enough about grazing, so I'll go past that one. That's the end of the presentation, and I'll just tune into the higher powers to help me answer these questions and hand it back to you, Kate.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. He's actually sitting right next to me. So we're going to play tag with the mute button so we don't get any feedback. But I'm sure everyone's mind's reeling, because Mark has synthesized into one presentation about a year's worth of presentations and information that he's collated, for some of it on behalf of us, on various activities that we've done over the last year. So that was really amazing. And I think a couple of points I'd like to make that seem obvious to me is that you have to really be a scientist in your own paddock, because so much of this is context specific. And I think doing trials, for want of a better phrase, safe to fail trials, where you can have a try at something. You don't turn your whole farm over to doing something without having a go first and seeing what works in your context is really important, don't you think, Mark?
Absolutely. Yep. Just trying to unmute it. Can you hear me there, Kate?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It's just, all of these things we're just learning, and the more we do, the more we find out. But it goes without saying that if you're trying something new, you should really just do it in a small way first and just see how it works, so you don't end up costing yourself a whole lot of money by doing something that might not work in your context.
Okay, so Dave Wren has asked a question, and he asks, if you have irrigation and surplus water, would you be planting annual or perennial multi-species for the March to May period?
Yeah, so Dave, obviously, you've got a much better chance of establishing your perennials when you've got irrigation through that first summer. So that gives you that option. But that said, obviously annual plants have their place. They're really good at growing quickly, putting on biomass and helping you build soil. So just depends on the situation and what you're trying to achieve. And you probably use a combination of both of them. You want to recruit lots of different functions, not just some. So they both offer benefits.
Okay, and Will has asked, what happens to all the beneficial bacteria and fungi in the summertime? Dormant or dead?
Well, the short answer is both. But obviously, especially the organisms that are in our environment would have naturally evolved dormancy mechanisms. And provided you've let your plants grow through to a stage where they've had long enough to complete their life cycle, which sometimes can be quite long, before they can get to reproductive stages. And also if you've got litter that's left behind that they can survive on and in, and even a better soil that they survive in better. But yeah, of course, there's a lot of dormant microbes in the soil at any one time for one reason or another, whether it's dry or waterlogged. And interestingly, that at any one time, probably 95% of the microbes in our soil are dormant, just as a rough figure. And as you get closer to a plant root, the diversity gets less because they're more specialized and associates of that plant, but the activity gets greater. So you might have 90% of the microbes around the root very active. And then in the bog soil, there's a greater diversity of microorganisms, but a lot of them are dormant at that time until the conditions are right for them. So, yeah.
All right, and Jim and Pam McGregor ask, at the foot of one of the early slides, there was a note about how to grow a planet, which is apparently a BBC documentary series. Is it worth watching?
Absolutely, it's fantastic. 3-part series. The first one's on the photosynthesis, the life from life, but there's also great stuff there on flowers and insects and how they evolved, and also on grasses, which is fascinating.
We'll ask, Christine Jones says to keep living roots in the ground all year round to grow soil, but how can you do that in our dry, hot summers?
Yeah, well, it's challenging, obviously, but the accounts of the early settlers that Christine has talked about, we did have green grass growing and all sorts of stuff growing in our summers and soft soil. So I think the answer is in maybe not being able to just jump to having things growing in summer straight away, but if we can improve our systems, and really biology is the biggest tool we've got in that sense, we might be able to get to the point where we can establish perennials and things that do grow through summer. We just have to manage them a bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, they'll be dormant rather than dead if they're well established.
Yeah, yep.
And as assuming.
Yeah, but they will hold on for longer. The
Yeah.
green, like you see your wetter areas of your pastures, for instance, there's still green feed around, into the summer. So yeah, if you can get your soil holding that moisture and just a bit more fertile and functional, then you definitely can sustain your green feed for longer.
Yeah. Doesn't look like they've got any more questions there. Just double check. Yep.
You got questions?
I've got questions.
Just in case.
Just in case. I did. I just wanted to raise. We often get asked about problems with toxicity of certain plants and even trees.
Yep.
And I wondered if you'd like to comment on that, Mark, when things like sorghum, for example, in the mix and things like that. Yeah.
So obviously, I mean, there's plants out there that have got defense mechanisms that that they sort of prevent them from being overgrazed. Some of these things, you obviously wouldn't selectively choose something purposely that was toxic in your paddock, but there are other things that you can implement as part of a mix, like buckwheat or sorghum, for instance, that if they only had that to eat, that you'd probably run into some trouble. But again, with the diversity, as a part of the diet, it can be medicinal, so it can work both ways. But obviously, you want to know what you're doing and not introduce something that's literally poisonous.
And in actual fact, I mean, ryegrass can be toxic too.
Yeah.
Yep. Get staggers and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So moderation in all things. That's my grandmother used to say.
There was a fruit tree in Africa that the animals used to get drunk on. That was quite funny too.
So Will asked, Will's got a common problem here. Our place swings from waterlogged to dry. Any tips on suitable species?
Ooh, geez, you put me in the deep end there, Will. That's something that I'd probably just want to look into a bit, to just try and get some exact species that can handle those really waterlogged and really dry conditions. Nothing's coming to mind specifically right now, but obviously, some of your perennial species are more hardy in that situation. Deeper rooted species can handle the dry better and probably can, have certain mechanisms to handle the waterlogging. But
also, isn't it a case of sometimes finding out what the reason, there might be some underlying reason for why you're getting rock hard in the summer and waterlogged in the winter, and it might be a compaction issue, or
it's not necessarily a perched water table if you're going from those extremes. So in that sense, it's probably your soil is not functioning as it should be, and so you could choose opportunistic species to try and rectify your soil so that you don't have such extremes, I guess.
I mean, things like daikon radish, or tillage relish, in the winter,
just to
help break it up, and then if you might find then you're able to put something like sunflowers in, because they are very deep rooted. They might not last the whole summer, but they'll put down big roots while they can,
for sure,
kind of thing. So some options. Jessica has asked how best to try and protect soil over the summer in annual cropping. We're looking at both winter and summer multi-species annual crop mixes. Cut crash crops high, leave stubble standing, or flail mow to create a mat.
All of those approaches can work. There's your stripper fronts. That's even. I think ultimately it's better for your soil if you get the organic matter down on the soil, protecting it. But the higher the biomass you produce, the better the protection factor, and you'll find with the multi-species cover crops, they really really dense out, and they give you really good cover if you let them go to maturity. And then you can actually put animals on there to push them down, or you could do any of the above, flail or roll them as well.
Yep. She said, wish I could afford a stripper farm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I don't know what that is. What's that?
Yeah, it just takes the heads off them, and then you've got these long stalks that you can just roll down, which is great, or seed into, which is great.
Right. Tony Muir asks, can Tagacestes tree lucerne become invasive, or is it generally controllable? Do you see it used much in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I mean, it's obviously a very functional species, but it may become weedy in certain situations. It won't become weedy in your paddock because the livestock don't
eat it.
They don't let any get away. So it is great fodder, and it's a really fast-growing legume that you maybe, if you do it responsibly and you control it, but I might get in trouble for saying much more than that.
Well, actually, we had a workshop quite recently. It was a weeds workshop, and Tagacestes got mentioned. But we were talking about some innovative ways of where you can mix and have shelter belts with Tagacestes and acacia saligna, for example, both of which are really good fodder. And you can either hedge those regularly, or you can let the stock come and graze where they can, depending on whether you've got cows or animals. So generally speaking, I think Tagacestes hasn't become too weedy around. And certainly, we weren't concerned about it. Put it that way.
I went to a great Centropic workshop last weekend, and they had some great ideas where they would use grass, like paddock or grassland areas, and they will mow it and literally windrow strips and leave them over summer just to rot down and like smother the weeds and become organic matter. And then they part them in winter and seed them really densely with all sorts of species, so that you've got various successions of really active species at all times growing, and it really sets the seed for the later succession species. And Tagacestes would be one of those, along with annual species and things, that sets the scene for your longer lived trees down the track.
Well, it looks like we might have come to the last of our questions. So thanks, Mark, for your time.
It was different that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, we don't normally have to do it this
organic.
way. And we've got a power outage in the office, so we're webinaring from home.
And my internet's terrible.
His internet's terrible. And it's, I don't know where all the rest of you are, but it's stinking hot here. It's been about 39, so kind of hot. But anyway, Mark is currently in the midst of a Southwest tour talking on sort of similar things.
It's part of it. Nutrition.
So if you want to catch him live to talk more about him with him on this topic, then I would recommend you register for one of his events. If you could let us know where and when next.
Well, we've got Tuesday night. It's Wilson Inlet catchment, so that will be in near Lowlands, Torbay. Then we're in Mount Barker for the Oyster Harbour one, and then we're also in Denmark for Wilson Inlet catchment group. I'm not sure of the exact venue addresses or names, but you can certainly look them up on the Department of Environment. Where would you find them?
Yes, so you can actually register for the event and find out more about them on the Soilwise website event page, and that is at estuaries.dewer.gov.au/soil-wise. It's a bit of a mouthful, I'm sorry. But even just Google Soilwise and it will come Soilwise WA, and it will come up. You'll be able to find it that way. And so for our audience, just before you sign out, can I ask you to complete our webinar evaluation form? I do need it for our sponsor, and only take you a couple of minutes. And it's also really helpful in making sure we are providing you with the right content. And lastly, it's great that we're having these conversations. You may or may not know that we've recently publicly launched our own online community and information hub, Talking After Hours, which we created to try and give our farming community the opportunity to have more conversations like this, share knowledge, skills and practices in a no judgment, easy access space anywhere and any time. It's what's different about Talking After Hours compared to, I'm going to give it a little bit of a plug here, I'm sorry, but compared to perhaps some other online communities that are available, is that our focus is on all things sustainable agriculture relevant to land managers here in the southwest of Western Australia. As a result, the information that we share and that content we develop is based on what's important to land managers here, on applying external know-how and research to our context here, and on our own experience and learnings from projects, trials, demonstrations, events we undertake here in the catchment. So another key difference is that it's free to join. So I'd like to encourage all of you to become part of the conversation and join Talking After Hours. You can register on our website at lowerblackwood.com.au/talking after hours. And as promised, in addition to emailing out this presentation, this webinar recording to you, I will be posting it on our knowledge bank and Talking After Hours, along with a PDF of Mark's presentation. And when you go into the knowledge bank on the community, you'll find all the other work that Mark's done.
And lots of other great
people to help with your learning. So, okay, so that's it for me. Thanks once again to our funder Soilwise for the support, and also to you for tuning in and bearing with us on our various technical problems today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Looks like this will be a beautiful warm one. So go out there and make hay or something. All right. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, folks.
And good night.